This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. As the rain pummeled my roof this weekend, I spent a little time simply enjoying it. The sound of the thunder and the delicate movement of the leaves under the raindrops. But pretty soon, I started to feel this prickly sort of feeling. I found myself wanting to check my phone. How much rain were we actually supposed to get? Was that new drainage system we installed last year going to keep our basement dry? Should I check in with my colleagues on Slack, see if we need to do any flood coverage over the weekend? Instead of the peaceful patter of raindrops, I was hearing echoes of news stories like these.
We are going to begin with the news, and the news this morning is not good in Vermont.
Vermont under a state of emergency tonight. Some of the worst flooding in nearly 100 years.
A major part of that flooding was from the Winooski River here, overflowing its banks and reaching its second highest peak ever at 21 feet.
In the end, residents across the state reported more than 4,000 homes and 800 businesses were damaged.
Turns out the flooding of the last 2 years has rewired my brain a bit. I'm guessing yours might have been rewired too, especially if you live in a town that was hard hit by floodwaters, if you mucked out a neighbor's basement, or you helped fix a washed-out road. Today on the show, we're going to explore how individuals and communities can prepare themselves for the eventuality of a future flood. What did you learn from the past 2 summers about what to do if you hear a flood is coming? You can give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. First, though, we're going to get an update on statewide emergency preparedness. Our guest is Eric Forand, the director of Vermont Emergency Management. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, as I mentioned, we got a lot of rain over the weekend, a bit more expected this week. Some towns I heard got nearly 2 inches of rain in an hour. 3 counties were in a flash flood warning. What did you hear about some of the effects of the rains this past weekend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So over the weekend, the Emergency Operations Center was coordinating efforts across the state and ensuring that we had situational awareness of everything that was going on throughout the counties. And we'd heard through a couple different channels of incidences in Hartford where the VA had to move their emergency room. They had significant downtown flooding. They had some issues with road closures, which is basically what we saw across the state. A lot of road closures in the Hartford, White River Junction area, as well as the Waitsfield area, and some on 15 in Cambridge. And we saw some slope issues in the town of Bristol. So nothing significant in at the statewide level, but very important at the individual town levels. And we helped a few towns coordinate some resources, but overall we were able to just allow them to manage the situation on their own, which was great.
So what do you and your staff do ahead of a weekend and a week like this? When you think that there might be some severe weather coming in, you're not quite sure how severe. In what ways do you, quote unquote, activate yourselves?
That's a great question. It's about not knowing exactly what's going to come, so trying to get ready for everything. We use the word activate. We actually just increase our level of activation. The SCOC, the State Emergency Operations Center, is always activated 24/7, 365. So if we think, for example, this weekend a lot occurred, but last weekend actually there was a lot of predicted flooding that ended up not occurring. So the week prior to that, we moved the status level of the SCOC up to enhanced, which means that we bring in some additional state partners for situational awareness, both for them and for us. So think building and general services with our buildings around the state, or the Vermont National Guard or Agency of Transportation, just to ensure that we are in line with the National Weather Service and what they're predicting. So that might lead up to a couple of days. If we continue to get information that we think it's going to be a significant event, we will reach out to local municipalities through a couple different channels to ensure that they're aware of what's going on and what they should be doing to get ready. And then we will keep that going up until the event, and then through the event we'll reach out and make sure that they're getting the resources that they need. And if it becomes a much larger event, like 23 or 24, we could move to a partial activation or a full activation where we bring in all the state partners to support the entire state.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what you do, it seems like, is coordinating between every single different department at the state level.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, listeners, we'd love to hear from you and what you need, not just from your community leaders, but from the state to feel prepared for a flood or other extreme weather event. What have you learned from the last couple of years of flooding about what would be beneficial to you and your community? You can call in at 800-639-2211 or email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Eric, Vermont Emergency Management provides emergency training for community officials and emergency responders. Could you tell us a little bit more about those offerings, what's available?
Yeah, so every town by statute has to have an emergency management director appointed. And so VEM, Vermont Emergency Management, has created training tracks for those individuals, from a 2-hour training session for the new person to an 8-hour or a 140-hour certification course. So it allows the local EMDs, emergency management directors, to understand what their job responsibilities are and interact with other individuals in the same capacity. We also have regional emergency management committees, which allow those EMDs to work together in their local areas, usually around county lines, so they understand how they can support each other. For example, if one town gets hit and another doesn't, and they can share resources, they're going to get there much quicker than the state can, so they're there to support each other. So there's lots of things that we do on that level to try to support the towns. We also have regional coordinators that reach out to the towns on what we call blue sky days, when bad things aren't happening, to make sure that we have the resources that they need for training, for example, what you had mentioned, as well as planning exercises so they can validate their plans, working with them on their local emergency management plans. Those are the types of things that the regional coordinator will do. We also do outreach to the general public through local town fairs and other outreach programs.
Oh, we just got an email from a listener named Megan who says that I hope we can all remember that those with the least are typically the ones who lose the most in events like widespread flooding. Many mobile home parks and low-income housing lie in floodplains. Climate change will continue to most affect people without the means to easily move. Eric, maybe you could speak a bit to how Vermont Emergency Management works to specifically help those who might be in greater need when these types of extreme weather events hit Vermont.
Absolutely. The vulnerable population is always one of the things that we try to focus on, specifically as we reach out to towns and work on their local emergency management plans. There are specific sections that talk about vulnerable populations, think elder care facilities or mobile home parks. That way, the local municipalities, fire departments, police departments, rescue, understand that they may need to go there first. They may need to provide more support at those locations. So we work with the towns so they have a concept of what that might mean. And then at the state level, we work with the Agency of Human Services to try to provide resources as necessary, as well as through the VOEDs, the volunteer organizations active during disasters like the Red Cross, to support those vulnerable populations as needed. We've also done a lot of work over the last year with language accessibility, the same idea that that last 5% that can't necessarily support themselves or may not have English as their main language, we want to make sure that they get the communications as well.
So what does that mean, doing a lot of work in that area, like translating more documents?
Yes. One of the resources that is great for both towns and individuals is the VEM, so Vermont Emergency Management's website, vem.vermont.gov, and we've taken a lot of the preparatory booklets and manuals, and we call them one-pagers, and we've translated them into multiple languages, and they're all available on the website, so they're available to those other communities that might need them.
So, Eric, you have been in this role as director of Vermont Emergency Management during these last 2 summers where we saw these big flood events. For you, as a director of this key office and as a boss to many people, what were your main takeaways? What have you learned and perhaps changed about your work?
It's a great question. So after every disaster or an event or even an exercise, we always run what's called an after-action review. So we work with the individuals, both the agencies, the towns, local individuals, to see what we might be able to improve for the next one. So we're always trying to make sure that we are looking at it through a lens of we're not always perfect. We want to make sure that we make improvements as we go. So over the last year, we've made improvements to the Emergency Operations Center, basically the organizational structure. We've moved recovery in as a section. But we've also added regional coordinators to have more outreach Prior, we had 3, and now we have 6. So they cut in half the amount of towns that they had to cover. So it allows them much more ability to reach out to those towns during those blue skies, but also during the events. So a lot of the support that we've provided to the towns is what we've been focusing on over the last 2 years.
To qualify for federal disaster mitigation funding, states have to create what's called a hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. Our latest one came out in 2023. Last year, there was a report by the state auditor who found that the state had only followed about a third of the 2018 plan. And the auditor said that if the whole plan had been put into action, it could have helped the state weather the flooding of last summer and the year prior. Now, to be clear, these plans, you don't legally have to follow them. FEMA doesn't check to make sure that states follow their plans. It's more that they exist at all. It's a roadmap, if I understand it correctly. But first, I guess I want to know whose responsibility is it in state government to decide, how much of this plan are we going to really try to stick to it and develop and follow versus how much is simply aspirational?
Well, in general, Vermont Emergency Management, we have a section for mitigation, and they run that process. And like you said, they updated the plan in 23. But as you mentioned, the plan in general is aspirational, right? We want to throw as many things out there as that we think that we can or should do or possibly might be able to do over a certain amount of time. We're not always going to hit it based on funding, based on personnel, based on timing. Some things end up not being as well set up as they could have been in the past because the times have changed or the positions have changed or the general atmosphere has changed. So it's not the expectation that every single step on the mitigation plan is done. We use it as a guideline, kind of our guardrails, our time to lay out what we expect to do and what we hope to do and what we are trying to prep Vermont to be able to be more resilient for the next disaster.
I guess I struggle to understand what the utility of a plan is if those who are creating the plan know that it's not something that you're necessarily going to follow.
Well, it's not that we're not following the plan. The idea is that you set up these goals, much like you would have a goal for anything in life, and you work towards those goals. So we may not have hit them yet, but the idea is that they're still out there and they're still something that we're aiming for. And given more resources, more time, more understanding of what might need to be done out there, we might be able to achieve those. But the idea is that you want to put bigger things out there. You don't want to make a list of things that you already know that you can do, and those are on there as well. But you don't want to stop there. You want to make your vision, your horizon, your expectations higher so you have something to achieve in the future. So it's not that we don't want to create a to-do list that's already done. So we created a to-do list that we knew that we could do portions of it, parts of it, but we also put in things that were higher level that needed some more resources, that needed to be researched a little bit more, but we thought they were good ideas and they thought that they would help the state of Vermont to be ready for the next one. So we didn't necessarily achieve all of them, but that, like I said, it was our expectation to begin with. It's a 5-year plan. It gets redone every 5 years. Things will change slightly, but we use it as a track to keep going forward.
And how is progress on the 2023 plan going? Are there any any big projects that you feel really hopeful about or excited about that could help the state?
Well, we have a lot of buyouts, so home buyouts, so flooded properties. Over the last 10 years prior to 23, for example, we had about 200. And in the 2 years since 23, we've had 200. So we've doubled the amount of buyouts that we're working on. So there's a lot of demand out there for mitigation funding. We are oversubscribed, meaning that we had about $60 million for the last disaster, and we had about $400 in wants. So that goes back to the aspirational goals of what we can do with the money that we have.
I'm sorry, is that money's for buyouts specifically? Or?
No, it's for mitigation.
Mitigation. Okay.
So we can use the money for various projects, but what we try to look at potentially is bigger projects that have a bigger effect. Think floodplain mitigation, so let the rivers have space. So those are things that we looked at across the board. Obviously, money and resources is always part of the constraints there. But yeah, we've made great progress, and we're continuing to move forward on getting Vermont ready for the next one.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you might be able to share a couple ideas as we wrap up this conversation for individuals who are As I mentioned, I was at the top of this hour starting to feel that little prickle of anxiety about incoming rains in the spring and summer based on what we experienced these last 2 years. What are some suggestions for either things that individuals can do to prepare or resources, websites, places where people can go to find that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, when it starts to rain and you start to get those pricklies, the best thing to do is to prepare in advance. So one of the things that we always suggest is what's called Vermont Alert. You can go to the Vermont website at vem.vermont.gov and sign up for that. It's an alert system that will tell you in advance if weather is coming to your area. So you go in and you decide, I want to know about weather in Addison County. But you can also sign up for multiples. So say if you live in one county and work in another, you can sign up for both. But it'll give you weather alerts. So over the weekend, I was seeing flooding alerts, or I was seeing severe thunderstorm alerts, or I was seeing flash flood warnings. So they were all coming across my phone, like you said. But you can also get transportation alerts, roads are closed. You can also get infrastructure alerts like culverts are out or boil water notices. So those are all things that an individual can sign up for to get those alerts, to be ready, so to know what's going on. So then once you receive those alerts, you need to be ready to move or evacuate or hunker down, if the case may be. So have your supplies, your go bag or your stay bag, both directions, depending on what's going to happen. So do that all preemptively. Don't try to do it while the event's happening. So make sure that you have a bag ready to go that sustains you, and a bag in your basement that can sustain you for a little while at home if, for example, a road gets washed out and you can't get to the local grocery store. So VT alerts is a big one, but just knowledge. Going to the National Weather Service's website, they have river forecasts, so they can show you what predicted river rises may be, when they might be, so you just know in advance what is potentially going on. But that's kind of the pre-research that gets folks ready for events like these.
Eric Forand is the director of Vermont Emergency Management. Eric, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Miguel.
How have you worked to prepare your own home or community for another future flood? You can call in and share what you've learned to 800-639-2211 or by emailing Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. Coming up, we're going to take your calls. We'll also hear about ongoing flood recovery and preparedness efforts in Montpelier and the NEK. That's in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing flood preparedness. Various parts of Vermont have been affected in differing degrees by the flooding of the past few years. But Vermonters everywhere have worked together to help one another recover. With us for the rest of the hour are two flood recovery organizers. Megan Mathers is a volunteer coordinator with the Northeast Kingdom Organizing and the Kingdom United Resilience and Recovery Effort. Megan, welcome back to Vermont Edition.
Thanks for having me, Michaela.
I'm glad to speak with you again. We are also joined by John Copans. He's the executive director of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. John, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're glad to have you both. And listeners, we are glad to have you with us this Monday as well. If you have questions about how to ready yourself or your town for future flooding, or tips from what you've learned over the past few years, you can call us at 800-639-2211. Now, John, I saw some photos of the Winooski River as it runs near Montpelier on Saturday evening. Waters were pretty high, but things remained safe there. What does it feel like for you in times like that, considering what Montpelier went through back in 2023?
It is, we're in a steady state of alert as a community. We certainly, the reverberations from 2023 run strong, but similar with 2024, we've had, thankfully for us, a couple of near misses since the terrible floods of July of 2023. So it's prominent in the minds of our community as we try to sort of recover and think about how we're more resilient as a community.
Mm. And before we get into all of the logistics and planning that goes into all of the work that you two do. Megan, I would love to hear a little bit more from you as well about how you're kind of feeling emotionally going into this season of increasing rains, especially since you did so much work helping communities in the Northeast Kingdom recover from last year's flooding.
Yeah, I am feeling I was very triggered by that opening segment.
Mm.
Um, just hearing the flood reports from last year and in 2023. Yeah, I feel like, we're already starting to get that heavy rain, and it's only May at this point. I was also just down in Massachusetts this weekend at Broomfield Antique Fair and had to leave early because we got flooded out. So it's like,
Hmm.
it feels like it's following me and all of us. And yeah, we're all coming to the realization that this is becoming the new norm. So just prepping our nervous systems and also, as we're going to talk about, preparing ourselves to be more prepared and how we can better diversify the efforts.
Yes. Well, let's get into a bit of that work. John, tell us more about the organization, the commission that you work for. When was it formed? Who funds it? How does it work?
Yeah, we really came together out of the 2023 floods. It really was an existential moment for Montpelier. That inundation flood was the impacts were enormous, and so the community came together and really decided to form an organization to carry this resilience work forward, and to focus in not just on what happens in Montpelier, but also understanding that we really need to collaborate with our neighboring communities. We can't solve this flood resilience challenge alone. It's really about thinking as a watershed and collaborating across town lines as well. So we're working both at the household scale, the community scale, but also really at the watershed scale to try to collaborate and address these challenges.
Thinking as a watershed. So what other towns and communities does that mean you're working closely with?
We've hosted in December and then last week 2 gatherings of the towns that make up the Winooski watershed. And 20 to 25 communities across the watershed have come together, and so many of us are facing similar challenges, and we need to develop strategies that aren't town specific. So many sort of policies in Vermont flow through towns, but the reality is the waters do not originate in Montpelier, nor do they stop in Montpelier. They come from other communities and they flow downstream to other communities. And so when we're thinking about restoring floodplains and allowing the river more space to spread out, that really requires collaboration and it requires expertise. We actually just last week had a couple of river scientists really help us understand the modeling for how these rivers work, how it is helpful to restore floodplains. How much floodplain do you need to really make a difference in communities like Montpelier? So having that collective awareness, but also a collective sense of direction across these towns really feels important as we think about our future.
And Vermont Public actually worked closely with the PBS program NOVA last year to create a video explaining a bit how watersheds and watershed restoration work. We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes for today's episode of Vermont Edition. You said collaboration a lot there, John. And Megan, I know that collaboration and communication are key parts of the work of the 2 organizations that you're a part of. I'm wondering if anything that John was saying there about the necessary work of connecting communities was resonating for you.
Yeah, so Nico's original purpose was to serve as basically a coalition among various communities throughout the NEK. And I think we all know that the Northeast Kingdom is a bit unique in Vermont, as it is its own economic and cultural area, and it's rather large, so it can be really hard to bring everyone together. The population is much more spread out, but yeah, our efforts are based on community. It started from community, and having disasters happen really fortifies who your community is. So we've, kept our main mission of helping people with food services, economic and social connection, and environmental justice. But the disaster response has really become a large part of our efforts.
Let's bring in some calls here. We have Paul calling in from Berlin. Paul, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Paul Flint. I'm an inventor here in Berlin, which is next door to where you are, John. What I have invented is something called a streambot. Okay? And to summarize, what a streambot is it's an under $50 stream gauge. Now, I'm sure you all know that there are 3 stream gauges in the central Vermont area. And what we need, I feel, are closer to maybe 300 or 400. And they could be made for under $50 using the technology that I've developed. And if you would like, I'd be happy to contact you and show you my designs. And basically what you would be doing is placing these all around in all of the streams and having them report back and be able to predict where you'll get derechios. Do you think this could be made to work?
So if I understand it correctly, Paul has invented a type of sensor that measures water and potentially could be used to help predict flooding. And John, you had just mentioned that, you're part of a lot of work bringing in ideas from Montpelier residents and the surrounding community aimed at not only around flood recovery, but resilience and preventing future floods. Are these the types of innovations and ideas that you're hearing a lot about these days?
Stream gauges is exactly one of the things that came up last week. And one of the scientists said very clearly, more data is always better. We're fortunate in Montpelier that we've got a river gauge right adjacent to our community, and it's really helpful to us because there's forecasts associated with those gauges. So for the Montpelier community, yes, we tune into VT alerts, but also we go to the webpage where it forecasts what river level we're likely to see in the Winooski right near Montpelier. So I think in a big picture way, yes, more data is better, and bringing down the cost of acquiring that data is a great strategy. I can't obviously speak to the specifics of this technology that Paul's talking about, but I would say we need to be creative about how we're doing this monitoring work and gathering that data to really help inform the decisions we make, both in the long-term way, but also in the immediate way about whether we need to act in terms of preparing for a flood.
Paul, thanks so much for calling in and telling us about your invention. Let's go next to Peg in Cabot. Peg, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting this. I called in because I spent about a decade managing hazard mitigation money coming into the state after events in the 90s, and then moved down to the law school, and my house was destroyed during Irene, and I rebuilt it as a kind of resilience demonstration project.
Wow.
And have some ideas from that I wanted to pass on. And I'm currently on the Cabot Task Force, and we're very grateful for how good the state and the federal government have both gotten so much better at responding as the events come faster and more furiously. So it's kind of, we're just managing to keep pace, kind of. Wow. But there's a couple of things I wanted to point out, and one is flood shields that I'm not hearing a lot about, that have been put in a few places, on a bank in Montpelier, and a children's theater in Brattleboro, and the Lincoln Memorial Hall in Lincoln, Vermont. And they're not very expensive, and they work really well, and they worked really well in Lincoln when they were installed in the 90s, and they stood up beautifully during Irene. And FEMA hasn't been willing to cover them for currently in our hazard mitigation grant for Cabot. So it's just something to think about, because it's not that expensive. The company that builds them is still out there. Another example is we built a bulkhead protection door on the house in Cabot in South Royalton, that was only like $100 to build, and would be probably better than sandbags. It hasn't really been tested again yet, but the people who bought that house feel really confident about it, feel good that it's there. It's kind of like a rubber gasket, just like a mason jar, the old-fashioned mason jars that clamp down over a rubber gasket in the lid. It's the same idea, but with a bulkhead, using a rubber hose as the gasket, and hardware that was the cost for $100. So that's something anybody can almost do themselves if they're a little bit handy. And then another one.
Yeah, maybe perhaps one more.
One more, flood insurance. That in Vermont, the majority of the damage to homes and buildings before Irene, and much of it since Irene, it's just most of our damage comes from steep slope, fluvial erosion on mountainside streams, and that is not in any mapped river corridors or floodplains. And people don't know enough to buy flood insurance, but they're eligible to, so they should. And flood insurance is a pain, but if you're not in the floodplain, it's actually really relatively inexpensive. I could never have rebuilt in South Royalton without it.
So that's a couple really practical ideas from PEG with the Cabot Flood Task Force: flood insurance, bulkhead protection doors, flood shields. Megan, are these the types of conversations that you're having, you and your fellow volunteers and organizers are having with community members right now before we see, more floodwaters hit the region?
Yeah, so what Nico and Curve are currently doing is working to create a disaster resilience tour where we go town to town, especially with, similar to what John was talking about, towns that have similar floodplains, are paired communities, kind of what Eric was talking about earlier in the segment about this town, this town was affected, this town wasn't. They're there together. They can assist each other with needed resources. But we're now planning a tour to go around to these communities to meet with town officials, identify community leaders, and get neighbor-to-neighbor volunteer efforts involved to get everyone prepared with the things necessary to address flooding or any disaster, really, but really, obviously, really emphasizing the floods. And that means getting folks stocked with resilience hubs that have pumps and generators, shovels, dehumidifiers, anything needed to muck and gut homes, and make sure that every town has an easy to execute disaster resilience plan that's not only created and understood by the emergency director, but also by the community members themselves. So one thing we noticed during our experience of the 2024 and 2023 floods is that while the state does have the best intentions, oftentimes we find ourselves alone in dealing with this. And so we're trying to really bridge that gap, turning to each other, turning to our neighbors, our emergency medical services, and our town officials, so that we can all do this together and getting everyone acquainted with one another so that when the flood happens, we're not scrambling to make these connections. These connections already exist developed during those blue sky days, as Eric called it. So we're really building resilience for these communities and getting them acquainted with one another to have that dependability and connection.
And there are a number of organizations like yours operating in different parts of the state, including Berry Up. It's Berry City's long-term recovery group. We got an email about it from Shauna, who says that they are running quarterly community flood preparedness events called Facing the Water. They share skills and knowledge that they've learned from 2 years of flood response. They also run a disaster response training simulation called, get this, Buried Alive. I feel like I shouldn't laugh, but that's a pretty great pun. You can learn more at buryup.org. John, I'm curious if you're working with them or with other organizations like that on some of these training simulations or other ways that people can kind of help themselves learn and prepare.
Yeah, we actually have collaborated with something called the Medical Reserve Corps, which is part of the Vermont Department of Health, to put on what we call Go Bag workshops. And we've hosted 3 of them here in Montpelier. And essentially, it's just it's a 1-hour workshop to get people thinking about, okay, if I had to evacuate and I had only moments to do so, what am I going to bring with me? Just like both Megan and Eric are talking about, those decisions are so much easier to make when you're not in that moment of panic and urgency. And so having that list of things you know you're going to need to bring with you, and maybe even having some of those things already put together, really can make a big difference at that moment of panic. And it's not always just what are you going to bring with you, but sometimes it's what do you need in your house, because sometimes we're hunkering down. Maybe it's an ice storm or a snowstorm where we've lost electricity and we've got to sort of sustain ourselves for a number of days. And so really those workshops have been actually quite popular as people come together. What we find is that people are hungry. You know, we've been talking a little bit about sort of the anxiety of what's coming. What we find is giving somebody something tangible that they can do for their own household to make them feel more prepared is really helpful. The other thing that we always say at the beginning of these workshops is that when we're prepared as individuals and households, we're more prepared as communities. You know, if we were to lose our water system, let's say, the fact that somebody has water in the stored and ready to go means they're going to be less in need of some community source of water at that point. It'll mean they're in a position to help their neighbors. We're not all in a position to do those sorts of things, but for those of us who are, it can really make a difference, not just for our own household, but for the community as a whole.
We do have to pause here for one more quick break, but we'll take some more of your calls and dive a bit more into the nitty-gritty of flood preparedness when we come back. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. It's a rainy week, and fittingly, today on the show, we are discussing the ongoing flood recovery and preparedness efforts of towns in our region. Our guests are John Copans, the Executive Director of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience, and Megan Mathers, Volunteer Coordinator with Northeast Kingdom Organizing and the Kingdom United Resilience and Recovery Effort. Megan, you and I ran into each other a couple weeks ago when I was out thrifting, actually, and you told me that you all have been working on something called the Disaster Resilience Circus. It was one of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you today. When you say circus, are we talking popcorn and elephants and baton twirling or something else?
No, I mean, yes, I hope so, but kind of like the buried alive pun, sometimes you just have to bring some lightness into the situation. And so this tour that we're planning across the Northeast Kingdom will be a bit of like the graphic design will be circus themed, and we're going to bring some lightness to it and just get everyone on board. And there's a lot to juggle, like figuratively.
I see you.
So we're going to pull that into it just to create some lightness out of the situation. But we're working with the CROWS, Community Resilience Organizations, that is helping us build a toolkit to distribute to folks. So as John was talking about, just having that preparedness ahead of time can really make such a big difference. So we're putting together a toolkit that's useful for communities, various mutual aid groups, organizations, and also municipalities, just to help build that resilience in the face of a disaster. And it will contain things like emergency outreach, how to pack a go bag, tool lending library tips, how to coordinate volunteers, how to muck and gut a home safely, as well as mental health support and any other helpful resources to have in the face of a disaster. So we're going to go on tour and we're going to get people muck and gut kits. We're going to, like I said earlier, we're going to connect those town leaders with the community leaders and people who are willing to volunteer and create that hub within their own communities so that they're more resilient. And also because, as we all know, these types of disasters really take a toll on the people who are helping folks through this, and so we want to diversify that weight a bit. And it fell really hard on Nico's shoulders this last year in the 2024 floods throughout St. Johnsbury and Lindenville and the various pockets of the Northeast Kingdom. So we're really trying to get everyone more fortified to deal with this, so that we can be more present and available for issues that that we can really address.
Well, let's take another caller here. We have Ben in Montpelier on the line. Ben, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for John. I lived in Montpelier for about 12 years, and I was just wondering, the big construction that's going on downtown at State Street, I've heard different rumors about what that is all about. I've heard to separate the floodwater from the stormwater. The floodwater from the sewage water. I've also heard that it's a flood mitigation thing. So I was just wondering if you could explain what that big, huge construction project on State Street right now is all about. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. John?
Yeah, thanks so much. You were correct in your first description, which is Montpelier is one of those communities where when we have high water events, the storm water and the sewer water end up being commingled, and it can overwhelm the system. And that does ultimately, you might not call it a flooding event, but the reality is when that stormwater system is overwhelmed, it can lead to issues where there's backup into basements. And so that project will be helpful. It is a project to separate out and create essentially more capacity at the stormwater level. And that ultimately does improve our resilience because it allows for that water a little more space before things might back up. And again, we don't want that combining with our sewer system. That's never ideal. And overall, Montpelier is working to really separate out those two systems in its entirety.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, for calling in. I want to share an email that we got ahead of today's show from Nicandra in Heinsberg, who wrote in with her family's story of flood recovery. She said that over the past 10 years, her basement has flooded about 5 times. Prior to that, for the previous 30 years, it had been completely dry. In July 2023, Nicandra writes, we had 3 to 4 inches of water. Last year, it was 8 to 10 inches, each time being worse than the last, resulting in damage to our house and a completely washed out driveway. After last summer, they realized they needed to find a way to prevent future flooding. Their first attempt at mitigation was to call a basement solutions business. That plan involved new trenches and pumps, and it was going to cost them up to $10,000. So they called another company, and they came and found that an existing drain at their house was blocked by 8 feet of roots. Fixing that only cost them $450, and they say that their basement has been in great shape since. Megan, one of the things that stands out to me about Nicandra's story here is the dollar figures. Getting your home, if you're lucky enough to own a home, ready to withstand floodwaters, can be incredibly expensive. Are there resources or places where you can get grant funding or loans that you point NEK residents to who are maybe trying to do work similar to Nicandra in Heinsberg?
Yeah, so Curve Kingdom United Resilience and Recovery effort is really has a good grasp on what's available. So if folks have any questions or need any support, Curve is an invaluable resource. And they are able to connect people with, all the types of different grants and funds that exist. And even if someone's like, I don't know the right type of person to even contact about doing this work, even if I have the money, Curve is just so valuable for that connection. And Curve is really doing the work at keeping our communities resilient. And it's hard. It can be very lonesome out there when you're trying to address these issues, whether it's something wrong with your home or a concern about a town road. So we really need those long-term recovery groups to be there for people. And so we need to support them as much as possible because they do such great work.
Yeah. John, do you feel the same about the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience? Is part of your work also trying to connect homeowners with resources that'll help them feel a little bit less lonely, as Megan puts it, in this tough work of recovery and flood preparedness?
We actually are launching something in Montpelier called Montpelier NeighborNet, and in a way, it is about loneliness. What we know is that when you know and connected to your neighbors, you're more resilient. I was at the farmers market this weekend, and somebody shared with me the example. They were away during the flooding of 2023, but their neighbors who knew them and knew their house came over, even though they weren't there, and literally saw where the water was running and built a trench such that the water diverted from their house, really avoiding catastrophe for them. Now, that's an example of when we know our neighbors, when we're connected to our neighbors, we can look after our neighbors. Maybe it's a neighbor who doesn't have mobility and isn't on a cell phone or doesn't have internet connection, right? Having a buddy system to look after those sorts of neighbors can really make all of the difference. And so we're trying to do that at a community scale of building these little neighborhood organizations, or really supporting them in many instances because they already exist. Let's just help them along. Let's just give them some sort of fuel to keep them going, because we know that as a city, when we have those connections and we have that sense of community, it really adds up to being a more resilient place.
Well, speaking of resiliency, the municipal workers who help our towns recover are a key part of those efforts, as we were just reminded by Tom in Brookfield, who writes this email. My company provides emergency service to municipal utilities. When the storms hit on weekends, we all start checking our phones more often. We triage the calls and will respond the same day or as the situation requires. Today, and over the next few days, we will be doing mostly lightning damage repairs at 9 sites in 6 different towns from the top of I-91 down to southwestern Vermont. Everyone should be aware of the strain that these storms put on the municipal workers who are responsible for keeping utilities running under these circumstances. That strain is felt by so many different sectors of the Vermont population, Megan. I know your work also involves connecting people with emotional supports that they might need, perhaps people who are struggling with their mental health. I'm wondering if maybe we could close this conversation by you sharing some of those resources and ways that people can support their mental health during a flooding event.
Yeah, of course, what John was talking about, I really want to emphasize that those sunny sky days, the blue sky days, and how important it is to utilize the downtime and really create that commitment to keeping neighbors, communities connected through meals and events and various workshops. And not to sound like a broken record, but Curve is our go-to resource for if anyone is how do I do? I'm struggling, and this is from mental health struggles to financial struggles. The long-term resilience groups are covering it all. That is their mission, and their goal is to be there in the long run, because it's not just you need your basement mucking gutted. You need so much more once you've been affected by a flood. And just to speak to the work that the municipalities do.
We have about 20 seconds left here, too.
Oh, okay. Well, we're trying to take some of that load off of them. So, yeah, that's why we're trying to get community networks more involved.
And you can learn more on the websites for the Kingdom United Resilience and Recovery Effort, as well as Northeast Kingdom Organizing. Megan Mathers volunteers with both. Megan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by John Copans, the Executive Director of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. Look for much more work coming out of their group in the near future. John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Michaela. I really appreciate it.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today. But as always, you can weigh in on our show, pitch us your own ideas by emailing vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. You can also find Vermont Public on Instagram. Today's show is directed by James Stewart. Our managing producer is John Aarons, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.